Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. You're going to also want to make sure that the suspension's hanging, so go ahead and raise it by the actual subframe itself. After that, we're just going to go ahead and remove this hubcap right here. You can gently pull on it, set that aside, and then remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. If your wheel's stuck on there, just go ahead and put on a lug nut, give it a little bonk from the back. Remove the wheel. Now with the wheel off, we're going to start removing our caliper and then the rest of the brakes. To remove the caliper, typically I like to come in between this area with a nice pry bar. I'm going to gently pry between the caliper itself and the rotor, just enough to make it so I have a little bit of wiggle here. After that, remove your 2 17mm caliper bracket bolts. Leave that in there just a couple threads. Remove your other one. All right, we've got them both out. Now let's carefully grab our caliper. We're going to slide it up and off the rotor. Inspect the brake pads real quick. Essentially, we just want to make sure we have plenty of meat on these, just in case we need to do a brake job. And then we're just going to hang this so we're putting no pressure on our flex hose. Now let's just use a little bit of penetrant. 1 lug nut. And now we're just going to go ahead and give this a little bonk to try to get it off of here. Now if you're going to be replacing the rotors, you don't have to worry about hitting this, but if you're not replacing the rotors, make sure you come in this area and definitely don't damage any of your lug studs. Remove your rotor. Next, we're going to remove our axle nut right here. Do that using a 12.30mm socket. Set that aside. Apply some penetrant in this area. Then take a hammer and a punch. You're going to come right in the center right here and start driving this axle out of the bearing area. We just want to go far enough back to try to break it free. There we are. It's moving around a little bit. Feels as though it's starting to come free. Now we're going to move along to this area right here. This is where the ball joint mounts to the lower control arm. You're going to find 2 nuts and 1 bolt. Let's go ahead and remove the bolt first, and then we'll remove both of these nuts using a 17mm. Now let's take a nice pry bar. We're going to come up along the top of the control arm. You're going to see a nice hole in the top there. We're just going to go ahead and carefully try to pry down on this control arm to separate these 2 areas. Now we can swing this away. We're going to gently push the axle out of here. And now at this point, I'm going to continue on by pulling the knuckle out and away from the vehicle, being very careful not to put a pressure on our flex hose or our ABS wire. But what we're essentially trying to do is pull the axle out of the wheel bearing. Now if you have a bungee cord, we're just going to kind of use it as a safety strap. Just go ahead and wrap it around this area right here, and then we're just going to try to tie it up to something, being careful, not, like I said before, not to damage our ABS wire or brake hose. Essentially, when we try to knock the axle out of here, we just don't want it to fall down and potentially hurt us. Now from underneath the vehicle, we're going to start gently prying against the transmission and try to push this axle right out of here. Keep in mind, there's always the probability or even possibility that fluid might come out of this, so just watch your eyes. There's a little lip on here you can usually grab onto on the axle. If you can't grab it, just go ahead and spin the axle till you can. All right, that started coming out. Let's go a little further here. Now we can start pulling out our axle. There it is, friends. Before we can go ahead and install our brand new axle, let's have a look at this area right here. This is your axle seal, and it's technically supposed to be pressed into the transmission itself. You want to go ahead and give this a little feel and just make sure that it's nice and soft and pliable, and just inspect it and make sure it's not torn or worn in any way. If you see fluid coming down from here, now's a perfect time to go ahead and replace this seal. Otherwise, just use a nice clean rag and wipe it down. This is the side that we want to install into the transmission. It has the area for where the seal is, and then it also has this snap ring right here. This is very important. That's what holds the axle in the transmission. Let's go ahead and carefully start sliding this in. Be very careful around that seal. We don't want to go ahead and damage it. Once it feels as though it's semi-lined up, you can kind of feel that it doesn't want to spin at that point. We're going to continue on with a nice rubber mallet and just give this a couple loving bonks to try to drive it in. Just keep this axle nut on here. That's going to help protect the threads, not that the rubber mallet's going to do much. Okay, so while I was bonking it in, I could hear a couple light bonks, and then I heard like a nice deep bonk. That essentially tells me that I'm in as far as I can go. Now I'm going to just carefully feel behind this area. We just essentially want to make sure it's completely in there, and then just grab right onto it and give it a nice tug. This is making sure that the snap ring's locked into place and there's no way that this axle can come free from the transmission. Now we can continue. Now let's take some copper never sees and spray along these splines right here. You don't necessarily need to get it on the actual threads there. That's more for like a thread locker or something the like. After that, let's go ahead and take this. We're going to carefully slide it into the bearing and bring it right on through. This a nice wiggle, start getting it lined up. If it doesn't feel like it wants to line up, just go ahead and spin this until it does. There we are. Now at this point, we're going to grab our pry bar, start pulling down on this control arm so we can get the ball joint resituated. Let's carefully bring this down. We're going to start in both of our ball joint studs into the lower control arm there. After that, we can let this back up. Now once you have that situated, we're going to go ahead and grab onto our bolt. I went ahead and I cleaned up the threads with this on a wire wheel, and then of course I'm going to make sure that I add a little bit of red thread locker. I also put thread locker on each of these studs as well. Now I'm going to come up here, I'm going to go ahead and press down on this and try to squeeze these together. After that, take that mounting bolt, we'll go ahead and start it in by hand. You want to make sure you don't cross thread this in. Once it's started, go ahead and start both of those nuts. Once you have them all bottomed out, torque them to 55 foot-pounds. Now the next thing we need to do is clean up the back side of this rotor right here. This is the mating surface that's going to be right up against that brand new hub that we installed. Let's make sure it's clean and free of any debris. After you're done that, let's continue on to applying some copper never sees along this area here. Go ahead and grab the rotor, slide it right on there. Now at this point, I always like to use one of my lug nuts. I'm just going to go ahead and start it right on here and bottom it out. That's essentially going to prevent this from wobbling around and potentially getting rust or anything in between the two areas. Grab your caliper. We're just going to go ahead and slide those brake pads right over the rotor. Now we're going to take both of our bolts with some red thread locker. We'll start them right in there and bottom them out. Torque these to 79 foot-pounds. Now let's put some red thread locker right on this axle right here, and then we're going to take our brand new nut, put it right on there. And now at this point, you're going to want to make sure that you tighten it up by hand with a ratchet. After that, you can torque it to manufacturer specifications, but don't use an air gun because you could potentially damage your bearing. Now we're going to torque this to 217 foot-pounds. What you're going to notice as you try to tighten this is it's probably going to try to spin on you. If you don't have a second person that can go ahead and step on the brakes for you, you're just gonna have to use a bar coming across these studs just like I have it and all the way down to the ground. That's gonna prevent this from spinning. After you have it torqued, you're gonna make sure that you take a punch and you drive this part of the nut down into that groove right there. That's gonna lock it in so it can't loosen up. Perfect. At this point, we're just gonna give everything a double check. Make sure that your ABS wire is connected. You also wanna ensure that the flex hose for your brake caliper isn't twisted like a little pigtail or anything like that. That could potentially cause a restriction. You definitely torqued everything that we were supposed to torque along the way. After that, let's go ahead and remove this lug nut. We'll get the wheel on here, snug up the lug nuts, get the wheel back on the ground, and torque it to 76 foot-pounds. We have the wheel safely touching the ground. Let's torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you have a hubcap, make sure you go ahead and put it back on there. Okay friends, we got the car all back together. What's left to do now? Now you're gonna wanna go ahead and pump up your brake pedal so it's nice and firm. After that, take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks.